Before the Gen V show, Goldolkin and his own superhero army already existed in the boys' comic book universe, and their story is even darker, more disturbing, and far more tragic. This is the full, brutal story of the G-Men in the boys' comics, and how Vought eventually decided to erase them from existence. So the G-Men were founded by a man named John Goldolkin sometime after 1984. Goldolkin, who was equal parts eccentric visionary and predator, had somehow stolen, or perhaps recreated, the Compound V formula. With it in his hands, he struck a lucrative deal with Vought American. The corporation allowed him far more independence than their other superhero teams, so long as he kept the G-Men brand marketable and profitable. It was a rare arrangement, one that gave Goldolkin the freedom to run things his own way behind closed doors. Goldolkin began his recruitment in the most insidious way imaginable. He lured 6 children under a facade of toys, candy, and promises of belonging. What began as innocent trips to his mansion soon turned into something far darker. When the children eventually asked to go home, Goldolkin refused, spinning lies about destiny and greatness. He told them they were chosen, that they would be trained to become superheroes. In truth, they were captives, caught in the claws of a man who had no intention of letting them go. From there, the experiment began. Goldolkin started injecting the children with Compound V once a week. The process was a brutal gamble. Administering the serum so late in life was known to be extremely dangerous. Most adult test subjects didn't survive it. Each injection was a roll of the dice between death and power, and the children quickly learned that the price of becoming a hero could just as easily be their life. Despite the odds, the experiment succeeded. Out of that first group, 6 emerged with superpowers: 5-0, Silver Kincaid, Nubia, Groundhawk, Critter, and the Divine. They became the founding members of the very first G-Men team. When Vought American introduced them to the public, the narrative was carefully crafted. The G-Men were presented as misunderstood outcasts, orphans rejected by society because of their strange powers. But thanks to the benevolence of John Goldolkin, they had been given a home, a family, and a chance to use their gifts for good. The story was irresistible. Audiences ate it up. Overnight, the G-Men became media darlings, Vaught's most profitable team and second only to the Seven in terms of popularity. Merchandised, comics, Saturday morning cartoons, every channel of pop culture latched onto the G-Men's story of redemption and belonging. But behind the walls of the G-Mansion, the reality was far more sinister. When the G-Men were still children, barely 9 or 10 years old, Goldolkin began a campaign of abuse that went far beyond manipulation. He sexually exploited them, all while layering on a steady process of psychological conditioning. He brainwashed them into believing that loyalty to him was not just expected but natural. Those who resisted found themselves facing a different kind of pressure, bribes and threats. Goldolkin made it clear that if anyone spoke out, their glamorous lifestyle would vanish. Their fame, their wealth, their carefully constructed image, it would all collapse and they would be left with nothing. Over time, this created a warped cycle of loyalty. The G-Men mocked and derided Goldolkin behind his back, but in practice, their devotion to him was absolute. They obeyed him, not out of love, but out of fear and dependency. The control ran so deep that when one of their own began to crack under the abuse, when someone broke down or refused to be brainwashed, the others were the ones who silenced them. They killed their own teammates to preserve Goldolkin's secret. It was the ultimate proof of how twisted the family had become. Soon, the G-Men became so popular that Goldolkin began expanding his family. Riding on the team's skyrocketing fame, he decided to create spin-off groups, each one carefully branded to widen their appeal and flood the market with more merchandise. The first of these was G-Force, made up of another group of kidnapped children. They were taken not long after the original team, subjected to the same brutal training and injections of Compound V serum. When G-Force was unveiled to the public, the reaction was explosive. They were an instant hit, with sales of G-Men merchandise nearly doubling overnight. Vaught's accountants and executives couldn't argue with the numbers. Goldolkin had stumbled into a gold mine, and with success came greed. Encouraged by the profits, Goldolkin continued to replicate the process, forming team after team, G-Style, a group carefully curated to appeal to fashion-obsessed teens, G-Wiz, the rowdy young adult squad meant to draw in the college demographic, G-Coast, designed to capture the California and West Coast markets, G-Brits to break into the UK scene, and Pre-Wiz, a sort of farm team, where new recruits were kept until they could graduate to one of the other groups. On the surface, it was a genius marketing strategy. In reality, it was a nightmare assembly line of abuse and exploitation. Each new spin-off meant more children being abducted, indoctrinated, and forced into the G-Men system. Vought American, for all its public cheerleading, was deeply uneasy behind closed doors. Executives knew exactly how Godolkin operated: the kidnappings, the abuse, the reckless way he let the teams run wild. His independence, once seen as a perk, was now a liability. They worried about the G-Men's instability. Their upbringing made them volatile, prone to violence, and constantly clashing with the law. Every scandal was another potential crack in Vaught's carefully polished facade. The kidnappings became an even bigger issue. Each missing child increased the risk of exposure, the chance that someone outside the system would start asking dangerous questions. Eventually, Vought ordered Godolkin to stop recruiting entirely. Publicly, he agreed. Privately, he ignored them. The abductions continued in secret, with Godolkin always convinced he was too clever to be caught. It was only a matter of time before tensions within the ever-growing roster of G-Men erupted. At some point, Too Cool, a member of either the G-Men or G-Force, formed close ties with members of G-Style and G-Coast. Then came an incident, never fully explained, where Too Cool was killed. His death sparked a vicious feud between the two teams. Each side blamed the other, and the hatred that followed ran so deep that whenever G-Style and G-Coast crossed paths, the other teams dreaded being caught in the middle. Rivalries were common among soups, but this one was toxic enough to destabilize the entire G-Men brand. And the dysfunction didn't stop there. Another infamous moment came from G-Wiz, the group of young adults waiting to be sorted into more prestigious teams. When a fresh recruit joined, older members convinced him that initiation required shaving the snow leopards at the Bronx Zoo. Naive and desperate to belong, he believed them. The prank went horribly wrong. The recruit was mauled so savagely that he lost an arm and a leg, both later replaced with cybernetics. But the real damage was to his mind. He was left brain dead, permanently broken. In the twisted culture of the G-Men, instead of being cast aside, he was given a name: the dude with no name. Over the years, countless generations of G-Wiz members cared for him, keeping him alive and treating him as a kind of mascot. They bizarrely called him an inspiration, a living reminder of loyalty and brotherhood. In truth, his condition was nothing more than another monument to Godolkin's cruelty, preserved and normalized inside the walls of the G-Mansion. Eventually, one of the original G-Men, Nubia, could no longer endure the trauma she had suffered. Years of abuse, conditioning, and the fractured existence Godolkin forced upon her finally shattered her mind. In her madness, she turned her rage outward, launching an attack on 3 Mile Island. The situation was dire enough that Godolkin sent Silver Kincaid to stop her. With little choice, Silver used her powers in the most brutal way possible, collapsing Nubia's heart inside her chest, killing her instantly. To most, it was a tragic but necessary end. To Godolkin, it was unthinkable. He could not accept that one of his children had died. Obsessed with preserving his family, he demanded Vought use Nubia in their new resurrection experiments, the same process they were trialing with Lamplighter. Against their better judgment, Vought complied. The process worked, in a sense. Nubia's body was restored to life, but her mind was nearly gone. She stumbled about the mansion, capable of only the simplest speech. Her words were heartbreaking, constant, pitiful pleas to those around her to end her suffering. She existed as little more than a husk, a grotesque parody of Godolkin's idealized family. The incident horrified Vought. Nubia's breakdown and Godolkin's refusal to let her rest convinced the company that he was becoming a liability. They began to question whether the G-Men, despite their profitability, were worth the escalating risks. Quietly, behind the scenes, Vought started drafting contingency plans, ways to rein in or even eliminate both Godolkin and his ever-growing army of unstable soups. Meanwhile, Silver Kincaid herself was left broken by the ordeal. Forced to murder her own teammate, she began to fracture free of Godolkin's conditioning. She secretly sought out Susan Rayner, a government official with deep ties to Vought oversight. Silver begged her for help, hoping someone in power would finally intervene in the horrors inside the G-Mansion. But Rayner had her own agenda. Instead of freeing Silver from Godolkin's grip, she coerced her into becoming a spy. For 3 years, Silver fed Raina information about the G-Men, their structure, their rivalries, their crimes. And for 3 years, Raina used that intelligence to strengthen her own position, offering Silver nothing in return. Inevitably, Godolkin grew suspicious, terrified of being discovered, and with her ingrained loyalty pulling her back toward him, Silver unraveled. The weight of decades of abuse and betrayal crushed her. In the end, she broke completely. Returning to Cranbrook, the small town where she had been kidnapped nearly 30 years earlier, stood before dozens of shocked civilians and used her powers to kill herself. Her public suicide forced Raina's hand. To contain the fallout, she brought in Billy Butcher and the boys to investigate what was really happening inside the G-Men empire. Each member was tasked with a role. Huey Campbell, their newest recruit, would infiltrate the young adult squad, G-Wiz, using the fake codename Bagpipe. Butcher would press Raina on why she was suddenly so interested in the G-Men. Mother's Milk would dig into Silver Kincaid's past to understand why she chose Cranbrook as the stage for her death. Inside G-Wiz, Huey got his first true look at Godolkin's twisted system. With no real supervision or guidance, the young G-Wiz soups had turned into a cesspool of unchecked urges. They were sexually depraved, boundaryless, and often reckless. Yet beneath the chaos, Huey noticed something surprising, a genuine bond. They were crude, wild, and deeply flawed, but they weren't cruel in the way the older teams were. To Huey, they seemed, at least in their own way, like decent people who had simply been left adrift. His time with them eventually led him to the G-Mansion itself. There, Huey met John Godolkin face to face. Godolkin, intrigued but skeptical, listened to Huey's fabricated backstory. He disliked how old Huey was compared to most recruits, but ultimately accepted him. More importantly, Huey succeeded in planting bugs throughout the mansion, giving the boys an inside ear. It was in the lavatories where Huey experienced one of his most chilling moments. Alone, he suddenly came face to face with the undead Nubia. Her presence was grotesque, her mind shattered beyond repair. Huey screamed in terror. Godolkin soon arrived, calmly having her escorted away as though nothing were wrong. When Huey challenged him about why he kept Nubia alive in such a pitiful state, Godolkin revealed the disturbing truth: his obsession with never letting go of his children. Frenchie and the female, listening in through the planted bugs, were shaken by his words. They understood then that Godolkin's control was not just about power or profit, it was about possession, a deranged paternal instinct twisted into something monstrous. Meanwhile, Butcher uncovered Raina's manipulation of Silver Kincaid, while Mother's Milk pieced together Silver's history before her kidnapping, humanizing her beyond the G-Men facade. Huey, however, found himself torn. After spending more time with G-Wiz, he saw their depravity, but also their innocence. They weren't like the others. They still had a chance. Desperate, he begged Butcher for more time to spy, hoping he might find a way to save them. To his surprise, Butcher agreed. At the G-Mansion, Godolkin gathered his children for brunch, joined by members of both the G-Men and G-Force. As always, the event was equal parts family meal and propaganda session. Godolkin, seated at the head of the long dining table, delivered one of his trademark speeches. He reminded them all of their supposed status as outcasts, misunderstood by the world but bound together as a family. His words were syrupy and self-aggrandizing, dripping with the false humility of a man who considered himself their savior. But the cracks were visible. 5-0, one of the earliest recruits, openly jeered at Godolkin, mocking the idea that their father was one of them. The others chuckled, the tension hovering beneath the laughter. For all their enforced loyalty, the older members no longer believed his lies, not completely. During the meal, Critter raised a subject most others avoided: recruitment. With Bagpipe, Huey now added to their ranks, and the sheer number of G-Men swelling with every new spin-off, the risk of exposure was growing, impossible to ignore. More members meant more chances for someone to slip up, to let the truth about the kidnappings and abuse leak out. Critter, his tone unusually serious, begged Godolkin to stop bringing in more children. Godolkin, however, brushed it off. He leaned back, his voice calm but firm, and gave a chilling answer. For good or ill, my children, I just can't seem to stop. The words landed like a confession, but in the warped family dynamic of the G-Mansion, no one dared challenge him further. Later, 5-0, Cold Snap, Critter, and the Divine shared drinks. What began as casual banter quickly soured when Divine brought up the impending arrival of G-Style, a team whose presence annoyed the others. Cold Snap, ever the reluctant mediator, told 5-0 that Godolkin wanted the two of them to keep the peace between the rival factions. 5-0 was clearly irritated at the burden, grumbling about how impossible it was to police such dysfunctional teams. As the drinks flowed, Critter let slip something even more troubling. Vought had recently sent an inquiry about Bagpipe. They had no record of his supposed background. Suspicion was already stirring around Huey's cover story. Meanwhile, Butcher was putting the pieces together. He realized Huey was becoming too emotionally attached to G-Wiz and that his cover wouldn't last long. Deciding it was too dangerous, Butcher told him the mission was over. But Huey, clinging to the belief that G-Wiz could still be saved, defied orders and went back anyway. Elsewhere, Cold Snap and 5-0 discussed the escalating rivalry between G-Coast and G-Style. Their latest attempt to keep the peace had failed miserably. Cold Snap revealed an alarming incident. A G-Coast member named Homefry had drunkenly confessed details about the G-Men to a prostitute. When word reached the mansion, Homefry was beaten savagely, and the prostitute was silenced, killed before she could speak a word to the outside world. The conversation turned darker. Cold Snap questioned aloud whether Silver Kincaid hadn't simply taken the easy way out, and whether perhaps she was right to escape the nightmare. He admitted he pitied G-Wiz, who were barely surviving Godolkin's ongoing sexual abuse. 5-0 shut him down. His voice was sharp, defensive, almost panicked. He insisted that despite everything, the life they lived was amazing. The fame, the wealth, the lifestyle, it was all worth the price Godolkin demanded. To him, Silver Kincaid hadn't been brave, she had been selfish. In his words, she deserved to die for nearly destroying what they had. The exchange left an uneasy silence between them, a silence that revealed just how deep the fractures within the G-Men ran, and how thoroughly Godolkin's poison had warped their sense of morality. During a tense phone call with John Godolkin, Vaught's executive James Stillwell flatly refused his latest demand, to put Silver Kincaid through the resurrection process. Godolkin pleaded, insisting Silver could be restored just like Nubia. Stillwell, however, shut him down. The process was a failure. Nubia was living proof. Bringing Silver back would only produce another broken husk, not the daughter Godolkin claimed to love. But Godolkin refused to listen, rambling about family and second chances. As he ranted, Stillwell heard something faint on the other end of the line, the sound of children. In that moment, his suspicions were confirmed. Godolkin had secretly started another pre-Wiz team, defying Vaught's direct orders. Furious, Stillwell demanded answers, but Godolkin ignored his rage, circling back to his obsession with resurrecting Silver Kincaid. When his pleas were once again rejected, Stillwell coldly hung up, his disgust deepening. Later, reviewing internal files, Stillwell noticed something else disturbing: the suspicious recruitment of a new G-Wiz member, Huey Campbell. It didn't take him long to piece it together. The boys had infiltrated the G-Men. Silver Kincaid's funeral was no moment of respect. Instead, it turned into a grotesque parody of mourning. Her fellow G-Men mocked her relentlessly, sneering at her statue and jeering at the flowers laid in her memory. Decades of bitterness and denial erupted as they spat on her legacy, cursing her for daring to defy their father. Godolkin, as always, used the moment for performance. Standing before them all, he delivered another one of his overwrought speeches. His words were melodramatic, riddled with self-pity and grandeur, so much so that even his most loyal children cringed in discomfort. But their unease turned to horror when he hinted, with chilling certainty, that Silver might one day be brought back, just as Nubia had been. The idea left the room unsettled, another reminder of how far his obsession went. Then, in a moment of breathtaking bad taste, King Helmet of G-Star was invited to speak. He began with smug boasts about his supposed friendship with Silver Kincaid, painting her as his closest ally. The lie was swiftly punctured when 5-0 loudly interjected, revealing Silver had actually detested him. Predictably, insults turned into shoving, and the funeral dissolved into yet another chaotic brawl between rival teams. On the sidelines, Huey quietly learned something painful from his G-Wiz companions. Their greatest fear wasn't death or Vought, it was losing each other. They dreaded the day they'd be reassigned to different teams, their fragile brotherhood torn apart. Hearing this only strengthened Huey's resolve to help them. Meanwhile, the rest of the boys were scrambling. They'd discovered Huey had defied Butcher's orders, gone back undercover, and was in danger of exposure. Realizing he might not make it out alive, they rushed to reach him. Their fears soon proved correct. Not long after the funeral, Stillwell called Godolkin again. This time he revealed the truth. Bagpipe was Huey Campbell, an infiltrator for the boys. But rather than eliminate Huey immediately, Godolkin saw leverage. He declared he would hold the spy hostage, forcing Stillwell to bribe him. If Stillwell wanted Huey handled quietly, he would have to sweeten the deal with what Godolkin wanted most: the promise of Silver Kincaid's resurrection. Acting on Godolkin's orders, the members of GWIS lured Huey outside the mansion. There, they confronted him, admitting they knew he was a spy. Worse, they revealed Godolkin had ordered them to kill him. Huey tried desperately to reach them, appealing to the bond they shared, to their hidden resentment of the other teams, to any scrap of doubt, but his words fell on deaf ears. Broken as they were, their loyalty to Godolkin still outweighed everything else. The attack began. Huey held out as best he could, staving off death through sheer panic and luck, until salvation arrived: the boys. The fight was bloody and one-sided. By the end, all but one GWIS member lay dead. The survivor, Jamal, finally broke the silence. Shaken, he revealed everything to the boys: the kidnappings, the weekly injections of Compound V serum, the constant abuse, the brainwashing, and, worst of all, the sexual exploitation every G-man endured. He spoke the words with shame, his voice cracking as Huey listened in horror. For Huey, who had seen flashes of innocence in GWIS, the truth was unbearable. Before they could process it, Jamal was abruptly cut down, killed by Europo, a teleporting super who appeared in a flash, and with him came the entire G-Men franchise, assembled en masse to confront the intruders. Standing shoulder to shoulder, hundreds of Godolkin's children declared their undying loyalty. They shouted in unison that none of them had ever said no to the abuse, that they embraced it, that they would all gladly die for their father. Their fanaticism was chilling, their brokenness absolute. Huey, sickened to his core by what he had heard and seen, raised his voice above the crowd. Rage and disgust fueling him, he led the boys in what seemed like a suicide charge against the overwhelming mass of G-men. But before either side could strike, salvation or damnation arrived. James Stillwell appeared with Red River, Vought American's elite paramilitary unit. The G-men immediately stood down, convinced the soldiers were there to deal with the boys. In reality, their arrival marked the moment Vaught's patience with Godolkin finally snapped. However, unbeknownst to John Godolkin, the walls were already closing in. His refusal to eliminate Huey Campbell, his blatant defiance in creating another pre-Wiz squad against orders, and his increasingly grotesque obsession with resurrecting dead G-men had pushed Vought too far. Even the corporation, long complicit in his crimes, found the results disgusting. To them, Godolkin was no longer an asset, but a liability. His empire had become too unstable, too unpredictable. And so, Vought made the call. To the absolute horror of the boys, Red River, Vought American's private paramilitary, suddenly opened fire. The massacre was swift and merciless. Saws ripped through flesh, RPGs turned walls to rubble, and flamethrowers reduced the mansion to an inferno. There was no negotiation, no chance of survival. Godolkin, screaming in denial, was gunned down, alongside every single one of his so-called children. The entire G-Men franchise was wiped out in a single, calculated act of corporate cleansing. As the estate burned to the ground, James Stillwell confronted Billy Butcher. Calm, collected, and utterly unshaken, Stillwell allowed the boys to leave, but his message was clear. They were being spared only out of convenience. If they ever interfered in Vaught's affairs again, there would be no mercy. The purge didn't stop at the mansion, because the pre-Wiz team had not been present during the slaughter. Stillwell arranged a quieter solution. The children were locked in a crate, loaded onto a plane, and unceremoniously dropped over Iceland, left to die in the frozen wasteland. Even the pitiful dude with no name, long kept as GWiz's mascot, was eliminated. Vought wanted no loose ends. In the aftermath, Vought turned its attention to the boys themselves. With the G-men erased, the corporation had resources to spare and no patience left. Their first attempt at retaliation was to unleash the superhero team Payback to kill them. Behind closed doors, Stillwell met with the Homelander to discuss the fallout. Publicly, the destruction of the G-Men was spun as a business decision that would positively affect the Seven by consolidating Vought's profits. Homelander, however, was less interested in numbers. He wanted to take the fight directly to the boys, to crush them as an example. Stillwell reminded him that, thanks to the evidence Butcher had gathered, Vought's hands were tied. Any direct action risked exposure. Yet for the Homelander, the massacre of the G-Men was a chilling revelation. The G-Men had been Vought's most profitable franchise, second only to the Seven, and Stillwell had erased them without hesitation. If Vought could discard them so easily, what was stopping the company from doing the same to him? For the first time, real doubt crept into the Homelander's mind. That doubt would soon fester into the seeds of rebellion. Meanwhile, the relationship between the boys and the CIA deteriorated further. During one of their private encounters, Butcher made his contempt for Susan Raynor brutally clear. He threatened to murder her and her family if she ever withheld information again, or if she went near another superhero team without his knowledge. The threat poisoned their partnership, ensuring constant friction between the boys and their supposed government allies. In the public eye, the destruction of the G-Men was given a very different explanation. It became the foundation of one of Vaught's greatest lies. The world was told that the G-Men had been killed by a mysterious extraterrestrial threat, an enemy so powerful that it required every superhero on Earth to join forces. Overnight, nearly all supes disappeared, supposedly leaving the planet to defend humanity from this unseen cosmic menace. In reality, they weren't saving the world. They were attending the annual debauched orgy known as Herogasm. The G-Men's slaughter was nothing more than a convenient cover story, one more layer of fiction in Vaught's endless cycle of lies. And with that, the story of Godolkin and his manufactured supers comes to an end.